Welcome back to Senate Education. It is Wednesday, February 2nd, 3:23 in the afternoon. We're going to shift now and talk with Mr. Moore. Welcome back. Great to have you. We have been working on a miscellaneous education bill, and in that bill, one of the pieces has to do with suspensions and expulsions. And last year we passed a bill making certain that our public schools were moving in the direction of stopping suspensions and expulsions for certain ages. We've also created a school discipline task force that is working on this issue. And so you have some language before you, Mr. Moore, as it relates to independent schools, and wondering if you would just take a few moments and weigh in and let us know your thoughts. And you're muted, Mill, just so you know.
Thank you, Senator Campion, and good afternoon to the committee. Yes, I'm aware of the work that was done last year on suspensions and expulsions, and I have a statement for you here. This is with respect to S283 and the text that appears on page 3, lines 9 through 13. That's the section that describes the requirement that children under age 8 should not be suspended or expelled from school except if the student is an imminent threat of harm or danger to others in the school. So I have two recommendations with respect to that, and a question that I'm going to insert in between the recommendations. So my first recommendation is that the term approved independent school be expanded to read approved independent schools accepting public funds. And the reason for that is, as you heard last week from Oliver Olson, who's the chair of the State Board of Education, the amendments to the independent school approval statutes made by Act 173 have divided the approved independent schools into two segments: those that are accepting public funds and those that are not. Those that are accepting public funds are involved in an obligation that's soon to be implemented to provide special education services and other duties. Schools that choose not to accept public funds can opt out of those other duties. So that's an important distinction, and I think that should be recognized in this legislation. And now my question, and that is, though the bill speaks of students posing an imminent threat to others, it doesn't say anything about those students that pose an imminent threat of self-harm. So I think if a student is in danger of harming him or herself, I think that also would be grounds for suspension or expulsion.
So I can just to bring you back a little bit last year to that conversation, Mr. Moore. The reason we didn't want those students to go home, we wanted those students to stay in school where they would be supervised, where they would get the attention they need, understanding that sometimes there are those supports at home, sometimes not, sometimes communication can get lost. So that was our thinking there.
Okay. Fine. I'm glad.
It's a good question. It's a good question. It came up last year as well. Good.
Yeah, it's pretty obvious, I guess. So my second recommendation is a little more complicated, and I'd like to introduce it by telling you something about that has been just happening in the final steps of the Act 173 rulemaking for independent school oversight. And that was we discovered that this was in the context of making certain that students with disabilities have fully equal opportunities to attend independent schools as well as public schools. And we discovered that the verb to enroll is susceptible to misunderstanding. Some took the verb to mean to enroll to mean to seek a place as a student in an independent school. Others took it as, no, that's the final act that occurs after a school's offer is made and the family and the student agree to the terms of the offer. And then there were others who thought that it was somewhere in between where the meaning of to enroll applied. And the reason for that confusion is rooted in the differences between how public schools and independent schools go about the business of taking in students. So in the independent schools community, a prospective student typically passes through 3 stages. First, they apply for a place, then the school's offer of acceptance is made, and then finally the student's family agrees to the terms. Whereas in the public schools, you show up. And the local district has to fulfill the state's constitutional entitlement that student has to a publicly supported education. So the rulemaking group understood that it was really important to be precise in describing in the rules which of these stages were critical to the non-discrimination requirements. And I recommend that same consideration be applied here when legislating in this context. At page 3 on line 9, the words enrolled in, I think would better be replaced by the word attending. That way it is absolutely clear the status of the students is the same, whether they're in public schools or independents.
I think that sounds fine. I'm not seeing any, I'm sorry, Senator Lyons, please. I see an objection.
No, I'm just trying to understand that that language is current law and the addition is underlined. That's a question for Jim.
Mr.
We can
Demeray.
ask him later.
Okay.
But just a clarification, if that's been the practice under current law, then we'd want to, sort of question whether we actually want to change it or not. That's all.
I understand that, certainly.
Yeah. Okay. Any questions for Mr. Moore? Senator Chinden, question.
Sure, you could tell. You just have this intuition about you.
No, it's in that case, it was more than that. Go ahead.
So, Mr. Moore, thank you for, is it Dr. Moore?
No.
No, okay. Mr. Moore, I definitely think the second one makes sense. I'd love to hear Jim Demaray's response to it. But going back to your first recommendation on the changing to just approved independent schools receiving public dollars, this has to do with expulsion. So I don't know the state law surrounding education and what rules are applying to independent schools and what aren't. Are there other examples where we carve out explicitly setting a regulatory control around kids in independently approved schools where we distinguish between accepting of public dollars versus not? I'm just wondering why we would want to make that the case when it seems to make sense. These are small kids. Why are we allowing schools to expel them?
I'm sorry, Senator, I don't have other examples at hand.
So, yeah, no, I think it's Senator Chinden raises a really good question, and something we can take a deeper dive into. I need to think this one through a little bit, but I would think at some small schools or some independent schools, we're trying to get to the same goal here. We heard a lot of testimony last year on how traumatic it really is to be suspended and or expelled. It really travels with somebody for their life. And so there's that piece. There's the academic piece, which piled onto it makes it hard to catch up, etc. So we can explore that question.
Bear in mind that the students attending schools not accepting public funds are not using any public money. So the leverage that the state has used with provision of money is absent here. Now you can still make the requirement, but it's in a different context.
Right, and I'm just thinking we require certain things of St. Michael's College, for example, that we might have UVM and our state colleges. I think
you require the Public Accommodations Act applies across the board for all independent schools.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But we are, sorry.
Yeah, no, please.
But if we are approving them as independent schools, I'm not clear as to why there would be a reason to separate this rule out as to whether or not. Isn't in a way, aren't we just setting this as another requirement to be approved as an independent school that you don't expel kids this age?
Yes, you can do it that way. Yep.
I'd love to hear if you have any other thoughts as to why you'd want that carve out. So are there examples where there are schools that aren't accepting?
simply trying to minimize the regulatory burden on schools that have said, we want to show that we are well-qualified providers of academic services, but by not taking public money, we are trying to stand apart from some other things.
It's an interesting question. So, for example, thinking of Vermont Academy, which doesn't receive any public funds.
No, that's not true. They do take some tuition students.
Oh, they do take some tuition students, so they would fall under this. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you for that. So I was just thinking of a boarding school model, if you will, where all of a sudden a student is caught, for whatever reason, they're making a determination that the student is no longer. Well, yeah, let me give it some more thought. Okay.
Yeah, well, there's only one boarding school that might possibly have children under age 8. That would be Kern Hatton Homes.
Right.
So that's a bit of an unusual case, as you know.
Yeah. Okay, any other questions for Mr. Moore at this point? Okay.
Very well. Thank you, Senators.
No, thank you very much. Thanks for coming in. So we are next going to return to waiting. Please, Senator Lyons.
I just see that Beth is here, and maybe we can ask her that question about the
Yes, go ahead,
underline
Senator Lyons.
I'm trying to find my page again.
This is on page 3, Beth,
Three.
of S283. Did you hear the question? Okay, she heard the question.
Oh, there she is. Okay, good.
Hi, Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. Yeah, so you're referring to page 3, line,
Eight,
8
sort of
through
7, 8.
13.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what's underlined is the new language in your miscellaneous ed bill. And what's not underlined is current law. I will say, though, for this subsection D, current law was just enacted last year or last session.
Oh.
So it might be something that might be, I mean, to me, in the face of it, makes sense to make the change. He wanted, Mill said, from enrolled to what? To
Approved independent
Attending.
schools accepting state funds or
oh
public
no, I'm
funds.
sorry. We're on the wrong bill. We're looking now. It's the correct bill, different section.
Oh, okay.
Page 3, little d.
Yep.
Yeah, so he was saying that for approved independent schools, they would be attending.
Oh, attending. Yep.
Yeah. I mean,
Attending instead of using the word
It's-
enrolled.
instead of enrolled.
Are you asking me?
We'd love a legal opinion on that.
I don't have one. I can look through the rest of Title 16 to see if there's any distinction. I'm not familiar enough with it yet to just know off the top of my head. But as a standalone word and under, a normal definition, I understand the distinction he was trying to make. For example, when we're talking about enrollment for kindergarten and being eligible for pre-K services, the law says that you, for kiddos who haven't, for 5-year-olds also who are not enrolled in kindergarten, and AOE has issued guidance that enrollment has a specific definition, which I don't want to misquote right now, so I'm not going to say it. But they did have to issue guidance to address the term enrollment in that particular situation. So it doesn't seem strange to me that there is a subsection of Vermonters who want clarification here as well for what does that mean. But I can look through Title 16 to see if there's any clear distinctions that we can draw upon, and then I can propose whatever language you'd like.
We'd appreciate that. It's interesting. When I hear of parents do seem to say, I'm going to enroll my child in kindergarten. I'm going to enroll my kid this year in school. So it's out there. And there is a process. I mean, right? If you move into a community, I mean, the school knows that, little Brian Jr. is going to arrive before he arrives, right? He's going to be signed up. He's going to be enrolled, right? There's going to be some process. They have to take him. I get it, but fill out some paperwork, put the street address down.
I don't know. I
Okay.
haven't had to do that myself.
Okay.
And I think it's
Yeah.
probably a little different for every school district.
Sure.
But
sure.
I'm just pulling up the AOE guidance now. So well, I don't want to waste everyone's time here while I wade through it, but there has been a need for clarification on what enrollment means before.
Okay. Senator Chittenden.
Since I think we have time before the next witness, I'd
Yeah.
like to, on the other point raised by Mr. Moore, Beth, I think you heard it because you started to talk about it. For such an exception, which I loved an impression you have of this is common practice when it comes to rules that we're applying to independently approved schools, whether or not they accepted public dollars. But would we also, if we went down that path, have to define and clarify if they accepted it within this fiscal year, or could these schools, if they really wanted to expel a kid, they could just disenroll all, or somehow state that the kids are no longer enrolled, then suspend the person and then start taking public dollars again? Would we have to go into that type of nuance, or do you have any thoughts on where else we might distinguish between an independently approved school if they accept public dollars or not?
I believe Mr. Moore was referring to rulemaking that's ongoing right now.
Mhm.
So it's not even a rule that's on the books. In current state law in Title 16, I would want to do a more exhaustive search through Title 16 because this is my third month working in Title 16 and I don't want to lead anyone astray. However, I have yet to encounter that distinction in Title 16, an independent school that is distinguished by accepting public funds. If there's if you choose to make that distinction, then I think so that's a policy decision. I think there's a further policy decision on how in the weeds you get on that. Accepting public funds, period. I think it would spring into action that requirement would spring into action the first time a school accepts public funds, naturally. If you wanted to be specific, that as soon as a check is cashed or something like that, you could get that granular. I don't think it's necessarily necessary should you make that policy decision. And
Senator Chittenden's question is interesting because it also touches on the Vermont Academy example. In other words, if they, as Mr. Moore was saying, if any school that takes public funds, so I could be there as a non-public funded kid, and under his language, it would, once any public funds go in, even if it's for somebody else's child, they're going to qualify in a way to have to apply, this bill would be applicable to them. Okay.
yes.
Yep. Okay.
I did, Senator, if you'll humor me, I did find the AOE guidance on enrollment regarding pre-kindergarten.
Yeah.
So they do specifically say, in other words, enrolled should be read as synonymous with a child's kindergarten attendance, rather than a reference to an enrollment paperwork process. So that's the distinction that AOE is issuing on when a kiddo is eligible for pre-K services. So pre-K kiddos who are 5, who are either not eligible or not enrolled in kindergarten are entitled to receive 10 hours of publicly funded pre-kindergarten education. And it appears that there needed to be some clarification on what does enrolled mean. And so AOE has issued guidance saying that enrolled should be read as synonymous with the child's attendance rather than the paperwork process.
Okay, so really, given that, there's no reason to change the language in the bill.
Well, so this guidance is specific to pre-kindergarten and kindergarten eligibility and enrollment.
Mhm,
So this guidance would not apply automatically to this language.
mhm.
I was using it as an example of there has been a confusion about the difference between enrollment and attendance before. And there has been a need to issue guidance on what does that mean. So should the committee choose to switch out enrollment, attendance for enrollment, that would be consistent with AOE guidance in another area of the
Okay.
law.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that. If you wouldn't mind just taking those 2 points and maybe putting in some kind of final recommendation to us, that would be great.
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you.
Welcome.
Committee. So we are now going to go back to waiting, which thrills me to no end. And we're going to have Brad James with us. I'm hoping that we'll have everybody in the state testify on this before it's over. Reaching out to newspapers for blanket invitation. Daphne, when you have a second, no rush, would you allow Mr. James to join us?
Admitting I'm not a chair champion.
Thanks so much. Mr. James, welcome back to Senate Education. Thanks for being with us this afternoon. We have you until we pick up a discussion on church and state at 4:30. You and I had corresponded briefly about how we might structure some of this time, but I would say after we hear from you for a few minutes, I'd like to send this right into question and answer time so that senators can get as much information as possible to help them in their decision-making process on this issue. But before we do that, would like to hear a little bit about ELL weights versus categorical grants. We've been talking about, in particular, what this might do for taxes statewide. What might the impact be? And then, any other general comments that you might have at this point. So with that, the floor is yours.
Okay, I may be fairly quick. First of all, Brad James, Agency of Education. And second of all, Senator Perslick and Senator Chittenden, I know you owe you both answers. I apologize. I'm not getting to things right now these days. So what I think I want to do, first of all, is kind of talk about how the weights are working. I mean, if you recall, one of the times I was in, maybe it was the last time I was in, we talked about how equalized pupils were working and how a weight can shift where the equalized pupils are counted. And that happens very drastically here with the ELL, if you use ELL as a weight in the equalized pupil calculation. And the reason is twofold. One, it's a very large weight, it's 2.49. The next largest weight is poverty, which is 1.03, and the next one after that is secondary, which I think is 0.37 or 9, one or the other. So it's a significantly larger weight. So what that does is that is going to add more to those districts that have those kids. A lot of districts have those kids. 93 districts have those kids. However, the distribution amongst those 93 is pretty skewed, and it's skewed heavily into Chittenden County because that's where most of the population is. Again, the data that we're talking about here is FY20 data. I don't have it handy for me for FY22, but it's FY20 that we used in the weighting study and the weighting task force, I should say, not the study. So the first thing that really skews it is the weight, and the weight itself, how the size of it. And the second thing is where the kids are. As I just said, they're really in small areas, not a very few number of districts. There are only 2 districts that have let me rephrase that. There are 77 districts that have 10 or less, and then there are a bunch that have 0. There are 7 districts that have between 11 and 25 ELL students. There are 5 districts that have between 25 and 100. And there are 2 that have between 100 and 200, and there are 2 that are over 200. So you can see the population is really pretty skewed in where it's spread out. That makes it difficult to equitably send equalized pupils out, because the idea is, people have these kids everywhere, but in this case, they don't. So what I would first like to draw your attention to is, hopefully Daphne, you got that on time, and I apologize to you for being so slow in getting it to you, is the first PDF I sent out, which I think you saw before when I was in one last time. And it's just a distribution of the ELL by town, by county. It's showing all the towns, and it's grouped by county. So it's hard to see because my graphing is not that good in PowerPoint, but it looks like this, okay? And you're seeing very small numbers pretty much across the board, except in Chittenden County, because that's where most of the kids are going. That's where the ELL students' parents are choosing to live. And there are reasons for that. And then you can see off to the far side on Washington County, there's a bit of a blip, and that tall blip there is Montpelier Roxbury. Barry is the next one. People think that has a lot. I think it's getting more people, which is why people think it has a sizable population of ELL students. But I think in 20 it wasn't as large as people thought it was. But that's the very first column, if you can barely see it, in that very light line that delineates Washington County. But what you need to see and understand is where those kids are. They are not uniformly spread throughout the state, and so that is going to skew the distribution. The second part of that PDF there is 2-pager, is just giving the ELL counts by county of residence. And Chittenden County has almost 1,400 ELL students. The next largest being Washington County, which has 113. So it's slightly over a factor of 10. Where the kids are. They just, again, as I said, it's not an even distribution, which we all know, and there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. Then I'll draw your attention to the third slide. Before I get to it, let me explain to you what it's showing. What I did was I took the equalized pupil count with using the new weights. So this is all with the new weights. I took the equalized pupil count first without using the ELL weight. So this would be the concept we're using an ELL categorical grant instead. And then I reran numbers and I put in the ELL weight and I took that count. I then looked at the difference between them. I used the counts with the grant as the base, and I said, how much does when you bring in the grant, what percentage does it change your equalized pupil count? So what you're seeing is a change in percentage, and we're using the pupil count with the grant as the base as 0. That's where we're starting from, and you either go up or down from that, plus or minus. And as you can see from the graph, it's kind of what you would expect seeing from those other graphs. Okay. Everything going this way, yeah, I'm pointing the right direction. Everything going that way is a negative number, and that is the vast, vast, vast majority of school districts. Is it a huge change? No, but it's 3%. All the ones that are even are those districts that do not have any ELL kids whatsoever, and so they're all 3.1% change, something like that. There are 7 districts who percentage-wise increase their equalized pupil count from the count without an EL weight. The big one there is Winooski. It has a very large population. That's the one that's about 36%. And then that's followed by Burlington at just under 20%. And then going down from Burlington, you have Colchester, you have South Burlington, then there's Winooski, the big one, then Essex, Westford, and CVU. Then if you drop way down towards the bottom, there's one that sticks out also. That's Montpelier Roxbury. That's the 7th. Everybody else will lose equalized pupils doing this. Barry is just so people know where Barry is, because people talk about Barry quite a bit in this context, is if you look at the Montpelier Roxbury line and go down 2, there's a tiny blip to the left, that's Barry. Okay, they're half a percentage loss, not a huge loss, but it's a loss nonetheless. So all I really want you to get out of this is to see what's happening when you use a weight. It really is shifting the equalized pupil count around significantly. What that means is if we keep spending constant, okay, so we're just hypothetically here, we're not worried about what people are going to do and how they're going to react. If you keep spending constant, then if you are one of these 7 school districts that are going to the right on this last graph, this last chart, then your tax rate would come down. If you're one of the many districts to the left, your tax rate would go up because your equalized pupil count has gone down. Remember, you get tax rates by taking your education spending, which we're presuming is staying constant, and you divide it by your equalized pupils. Divide by a smaller number, your spending per pupil goes up, your tax rate goes up. So that's the concept here that we're kind of looking at. So using an ELL weight, if nothing else changes, it's going to adversely impact every district except 7 in the state. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know. But one of the things that you need to understand is that there are 93 districts that have ELL students. Only 7 of them are gaining an increase using the weight. The other 86 are having a decline in their equalized pupils. And sometimes not a significant one, such as Berry, but it's a decline nevertheless. So that's.
Senator Chin, did you want to jump in, please?
I'm not trying to interrupt, Mr. James. Can you?
Please do.
All right, so this is great. So I just want to make clear, though, that this isn't without due reason or due cause. Like these districts are going to get more resources because the evidence shows these kids cost more to have equitable access to educational opportunity. But this ties into the real question I want to ask you today, which is related to this. And I'd like to share my screen just to frame this question. While I asked you about this in advance, I hope that's okay, Chair.
Absolutely.
Great. So what I have here, and let me see if you see it now, this is from the Public Assets Institute. Maybe you've seen this visual before, and it sort of describes how our education fund is funded.
I think I have.
So it's basically showing, and this is, I thought a visual is worth 1,000 words, and I talked too much already, so I wanted to show this. All right, so I see in this that the homesteads, those that live here in Vermont, that are voting on their school tax bills, they are contributing about 25% of our ed fund, and then 35% is coming from sales tax, rooms and meals tax, and 40% from stores, factories, ski areas, and second homes. My clarity that I'm seeking here is, with the pupil weights and the equalized pupils that you described here, is it true, is it correct that is really squeezing that turquoise bubble, that 25%, as to who's paying what? And then the second part of that question is, in what you understand about the cost equity formula, is that really going to draw the money across all 3 funds of this, rather than just squeezing the turquoise bubble, making some communities pay more, pay less, but with the cost equity, you draw from the entire ed fund off the top, as they say, which would effectively make everybody in Vermont, all throughout Vermont, all the ski areas, the factories, the stores, all compensating or contributing to the kids that need additional resources to have equal access. Am I making sense with my question?
You are. It's an excellent question, and there are a lot of moving parts and a lot of subtleties in there, and it's going to be very difficult to answer. Just so you know, to answer, I think we have to make a lot of assumptions, and I guess the first assumption we would try to make would be like I said earlier, education spending is staying constant, so the ed fund itself is staying constant. Okay, we're not going to change that, so we're not going to talk about how people are going to change their decisions if all these factors you're talking about change. We're keeping everything constant as it is. So first of all, on the homestead side, what it would do is it would shift who's paying. Is basically what it would do. In the case of these 7 that we're showing here, their tax rate would go down. And again, there are a lot of subtleties here. The yield would change and all this. We're kind of ignoring all that at the moment. But basically, broad concept at about 50,000 feet, those districts, their tax rate would go down. They would bring in less. They would be paying less into the education fund on the homestead side, whereas the other people would be picking it up because the education fund still needs that money. So their tax rates would be going up.
Real quick follow-up.
Yeah, please.
Okay, so that's great, but I want to be clear on the differences between what you just described there, and I don't even know if anybody really is, because the ed fund or the education funding is so complex. But with the equalized pupils that you walked us through the last time, that is really just changing that turquoise fund. Whereas if we were to do cost equity, I'm looking for some validation of my understanding from the implementation task force. You're going to take off the top from all 3 of these revenue sources, and that money gets divvied up in different amounts to the Winuskis, to the Burlingtons, to everybody that has an equalized pupil. Their education spending amount will go down. So their property taxes all things being equal, would go down because they get that money to pay down what they'd have to spend, spread out to their taxpayers. But I heard your other point there, but this is the really confusing part to many people. The yield would also go down, which would mean the whole state, including the stores, the factories, the ski areas, the second homes, the yield will go down, thus spreading the burden. If I'm looking to read your body language, if I'm right or not, but it would effectively spread the cost to achieve equity across the entire education fund sources.
More so. Yes,
Okay.
more so. What would happen in this scenario is the 35% would not change. I mean, because that's a fixed amount of money coming in. Yeah, that's basically what's happening. If we were to presume that the non-homestead tax rate doesn't change, that 40% wouldn't change either. But statutorily it will. I mean, again, as I said, there are lots of things going on in the background. But if we were to presume that it wasn't to change, then it would stay the same also. And then it would just be in that turquoise section. Okay. But if we're talking now about the cost equity piece, what happens there is that is coming off the top of the education fund. The non-home or not homestead taxes, the other sources, the 35%, that number's not going to change still. That's still going to be constant. Okay. And again, back to the subtleties, if you were to follow what the law says, then the homestead property tax, those people paying based on income, and the non-homestead property tax all change by the same percentage. That would change that turquoise and blue ratio somewhat. How, I don't know, but it would change it. But
will it change from the pupil distribution, or will it change from the effect on the yield by taking it off the top?
The part that I just said is about how the tax rates and the homestead household income percentage changed. Or let me start over again and rephrase it. So what the law says is, and this goes in the December 1 letter from the tax commissioner, is that the percentage change of the average taxpayer on those paying based on property, so your tax rate, straight tax rate, those paying based on income, so you do that household income percentage, and those non-homestead taxpayer will be the same. So if the ed fund is still needing the same amount of money, which kind of all things being considered, it probably will roughly, those shouldn't change significantly. So those percentages may wobble around a little bit, but probably not significantly. But in terms of the homestead property tax, which is where more of the education spending is coming from, or a good third of it is coming from, I think what would happen there is it would be more equitable in terms of the cost equity piece. In terms of it's coming off the top of the ed fund, everybody's paying for it equally, which I think is what you were after. It's affecting all the taxpayers equally, essentially.
This was very validating. Thank you for letting me ask those questions, and I hope I didn't really reveal my naivete on ed funding yet again.
No, great question, Senator Perchlik.
Thank you. Thanks, Brad. So the graph with the blue bars going horizontal, this is as compared to the ELL categorical grants at a certain dollar amount? But if there's grants, regardless of what the value is.
Exactly. That's a good question. And again, it gets into my wonky world. The ELL, or not the ELL, the equalized pupil calculation is independent of the ELL grant, of an ELL grant. Okay. It has to do simply with pupil counts and whatever weights you choose to use and how large those weights are. That's it. So the equalized pupil counts are independent of the grant itself. What does matter is, do you use a grant or not? And
so I think what you said when you said, here's the 7 districts that will have their pupil counts be increased, some substantially, and so therefore they would get more pupils. So if spending being equal, their taxes would go down. That's the impact, right? Or did you?
That's right. But again, as you know, certainly from being on the task force, the idea is that it would give these districts tax capacity to increase their now low tax rate back up, to bring more money in to give to these kids to provide service.
That was going to be, so if they did do that, if they raised their spending to meet the $22,000 average, let's say, how does that impact this week? Like, that's the tough question, right?
That is a tough question. If you, and I'm kind of thinking this through as we speak, if you presume that these people are going to increase their spending because they have the tax capacity, their education spending would then go up, then that's a bigger demand on the education fund. If there's now a bigger demand on the education fund, okay, and we're just talking about people who get the tax benefit, I guess, is for lack of a better term, who can raise their tax rate to bring money in for these kids, then that costs the education fund more money, which means that the property yield has to drop to push tax rates up to bring in enough money. It's kind of odd thinking, but that's what's happening. By the same token, though, you have districts on the other side whose tax rates are going to go up. So if they chose to bring their tax rate down, that means they would be spending less per pupil. And so that means the ed fund, that'd be less ed spending. That would be less demand on the ed fund. So it's hard to say where it's going to end up, but that's kind of the tension that's happening within the ed fund.
This is, if I may, I mean, this is historically the kinds of tensions that we're always talking about.
Yes.
Senator Persley, please.
Different ideas.
Yeah.
We'd heard a couple, we didn't really have the time to talk to Dr. Colby too much about it, but a couple times has been mentioned a hybrid approach. I don't know if anybody's brought that up to you. Like, you think that could work where some districts say I'll take the grant and some districts say I'll take the weight kind of thing?
I know that there's been a little talk about it. I haven't heard any detail or any serious talk. I've just kind of heard hybrid model. And so I'm thinking, again, from my world, how would I make that work? Because that's what I do. I get these ideas and then I have to make them work.
Mm-hmm.
Frankly, I don't see how it would work. I haven't really thought it through, and it would take me a while on this one. But the reason I don't see how it would work is because if you have people who are taking the weight, part of the weight then, well, I say I'm thinking this through. I think, well, I have to do it two different ways. but part of the weight that gets used to get to calculate the equalized pupils, it depends on it works from everybody in the state doing it. If you have some people opting out, then you don't have the whole state. So and again, I'm thinking this through very quickly as we're talking, is I guess what I would, if this were to pass, what I would probably have to do is I'd have to run equalized pupils two different ways, would be my guess, but I'm not even sure that's right. I would have to run it with ELO weight and without an ELO weight, but I'm not sure that would be right either. I don't know. I would have a lot of trouble making this work, I think. From my simplistic view, it's easier to go one way or the other.
Senator Persley?
That thing that I kind of had a better understanding today, talking with Dr. Colby, is that this is basically how it works now, right? And what you said, like this, this would happen. It would change the equalized pupil, but yeah, so what? That's the way it's already done. And so the current weights you could do a graph like this on the current ELO weight. It wouldn't be so great because it's whatever it is now, 0.39 instead of 2.49. So that's accurate, right? That you could do a graph like this today with any of the existing weights.
Yes.
But what you did here was just show the scale of it because it's such a large weight. So you feel like the largeness of the weight in the sparsity of the number of schools that have the students makes a difference and should be something we're thinking about.
I do, and you're right. I could show this for secondary. I could show it for any other ones where we have a similar weight. This one again, I showed this one particularly because it sounds like this is what the real conversation is between a number of committees, and it's specifically your committee, but other committees are talking about it too, is between the new weights, forgetting cost equity for the moment, between the new weights and a categorical grant for ELL, or the new weights plus an ELL weight. It's those two that I'm kind of addressing right here. And then there's a question between weights and cost equity that Senator Chittenden was talking about.
And one other question is, like, does this, because your other testimony was how weights impact other weights, is this beta just looking at EL weights, or does this take an impact to how weights affect other weights?
It takes an effect how weights affect other weights. Behind these numbers are all those other weights that came out of the task force. Okay, so that's the 0 column. Okay, and then the change in just adding one more weight is what you're seeing on there. And so all the other weights are on the first model, all the weights are in the second model, plus the ELL weight.
Right. Okay. Thank you. That's helpful.
Senator Chinden.
Mr. James, I think, is it Dr. James?
No, unfortunately.
I should know this, but Mr. James, I think I just heard you say something, and I want to confirm I'm still understanding this. The cost equity approach proposed in the implementation task force recommendations, one of the 2 options, that still uses weights, right? There are weights. Okay, great. So I thought I heard you say something else, but there are weights.
No, it does.
Yeah.
It does. No, I was differentiating between the weighting model and the cost equity, the 2 weighting ideas and the cost equity model. But yes, no, the weights are also used in the cost equity model. That's where the numbers come from, the dollar values.
Right. It's still dollar values, not weights. There's no weighting of pupils.
Right. There's no weighting of pupils. That would happen in the background. I would still have to do it, figure out everything, figure out how many kids there are, all that type of thing, but it would not roll forward.
So you'd use the weights to determine how much those kids of that certain cost, and then do it the average cost for all the regular, whatever, the pupil, not the equalized amount. And that above amount is what you would then send to the districts, and that would come off the top of the ed fund, and then we'd all pay for that through spreading it out through the yield.
Right. Well, what we'll be doing is we'll be taking the total weighted count, which you would never see, dividing that into the spending, saying here's the average cost, and then inflating it by whatever the weights are, and those would be the categorical grants, and that's what will come off the top of the ed fund. You're correct.
As a wrapping up point, and I'm sorry to talk so much, Chair Campion.
No, this is great.
That seems to me to be the most fair approach to this. And I'd love to actually start to see how these numbers work out, because at the core of this, I want to make sure these districts with these kids that have these identified additional needs are getting more resources. This seems to get there, but that's where I want to prove it out. But I think I can also explain this better. I'm going to work on some visuals over the next week or so, but the cost equity model seems to be a real clearer path forward for me as I've been wrestling with this topic.
One caution with it, and there are cautions on both sides, but one caution with this one is that remember the numbers that you're using are average numbers. And so the further a district gets away from having the average number, that category student, the more impact it's going to be. If they have fewer numbers, fewer of those kids, that might work. If they have more, they may not get enough. So when you start going, think of a bell curve. As you start getting out on the lower reaches, you're really starting to not fully fund people or overfund people, depending on which way you're going.
Senator Persley.
Yeah, Brad, another thing that we hear about a problem with any kind of categorical grant program is that it would lend itself to legislators that are always just trying to cut funding to cut the program in the future. Could you envision a program that's just kind of like that? It's a calculation that you do in your office and that we don't see it at all, kind of like other parts of the education formula. It's just part of the formula. And then all that the legislators would see was just like, this is the education fund, here's the yield, and move forward that way, instead of like, well, here's the appropriation. It's because if we were going to do a grant, that's the way I'd want it to do it. It was like something that Brad James figures out and just tells us, kind of like the yield or something. Like legislators don't say, oh, I don't like that yield, I'm going to change something.
Well, we do that. We do change the yield.
The legislators don't.
Right, we do. Well, we set the yield.
You set the yield.
But we set the yield based on what Brad James does. We don't.
Right.
We don't like that. Step 3. Let's change that 10 to an 8.
Sure.
The yield comes out different.
Right.
So that's the way I kind of see this kind of grant working. Is just like, here's the formula. Brad figures it out. This is the number. We don't even see that number. Basically, we see it as part of the education funding.
Right.
I think you can do that.
Basically protecting that number.
Yeah, I mean,
but that being said, just before you answer Senator Pershing's point is, in 10 years that number's gonna be very different. So how does the legislature interact with that number?
Well, that's where one of the recommendations that these numbers are revisited on a periodic basis, like every 4 or 5 years, something like that. So, but going back to Senator Burst's question, that does happen currently, where things happen in the background and the appropriation comes out. So here's the number, and it just goes to the appropriations bill. And that's it. That's the amount of money we use. That happens with the ELL grant, the early language, or not early language learners on my brain here, Triple E grant, the essential early education. That grows by an index, and the NEEP index that comes out in November from the 2 state economists. And it has a base number. It gets multiplied by a growth, and that's the number that we use that goes forward for that coming year. We do the same thing for transportation aid. We say how much money, there's a base that, again, this is all in legislation somewhere, in statute in Title 16. There's a base amount sitting here. It inflates by X, and you report to do it for mileage, you do it for a lot of different things. So it does happen the way. There's always that lovely term that the legislature can use, notwithstanding. Right. But in general, you can do that. And my thought would be is that with this type of thing, with the cost equity payment, you probably wouldn't break it out as an individual piece. You might say this is what they are, but it'd be one lump sum that you're talking about, because you're inflating them all by the same amount.
Senator Lyons.
Thank you. So if you, just a couple of things, if we were to do a comparison of other weights, so take a pick, whether it's poverty or based on, I'm going back to SNAP versus another way, would we see similar discrepancies as if we were going to compare it with some categorical? Because I mean, obviously SNAP and free and reduced lunch are programs that can be easily compared. I mean, you've got numbers, and you've got qualification. I'm forgetting my terms. Sorry.
I don't know either, so it's okay.
Yeah,
I know you've got direct certification, things like that.
Yes, all of that. So we have all that information, but we don't have that for our ELL programs. So, and the question, so that's one question. So if we did a comparison, would we see differences? Would we see the red side and the black side, so to speak, on the graph? And then the other question is, these programs, now that schools are becoming more savvy about what's needed, or at least they understand that they're going to have to be more savvy. We know that there are startup costs involved, and all the schools that now have these real large numbers of ELL students, they went through some really long, protracted times of building programs, and we heard a little bit about that yesterday from Winooski. So there's nothing in the categorical aid that really defines what startup monies would be needed for any school with ELL students at any level. And we're going to see more in our state. So that's a comment, but the other one is the comparison. Is it possible to do a comparison with some of the other weights and to look for how equally distributed the costs are throughout our different schools?
It's possible to do.
Is it worth it?
I'm not sure. That's good. That's a good question too. It's possible to do a comparison of here's what if we did poverty. We said we did the 1.03 versus what we currently have of 0.25. Yeah, 0.25. We could do that, and you would see shifts, and we could use it using the current data, the SNAP data, which is a smaller count. We could do the same thing by saying, okay, here's what it would be if we were doing the FRL data that we use in the task force modeling. Yeah, and you could do that comparison. And I think you would see, I think between the two, between SNAP and FRL, you would certainly see pluses and minuses. I'm not sure you would see it so much but just by changing the weight, because everybody'd still be going in one direction, I think that way. But if you compared the two, SNAP versus FRL, you would certainly see changes. What they would be, I don't know. Would it be worth doing anything? I don't know. I think one of the things that people like about the FRL data is that there's more of it. It's a higher pupil count by roughly double, if I recall correctly. And so it picks up more kids, and it probably gets a better idea in more districts. There's still issues with it, as we all know. So I think is it going to the idea, is it worth it? I'm not sure it really is. I'm not sure what it would show, except that it happens. Because we haven't talked about anything. I think the dramatic difference here is that we're talking about a categorical grant versus a weight. And I think the categorical grant, as Senator Chittenden was talking about, would kind of direct the money more towards where the kids are, or maybe Senator Perch, maybe it's both, would direct the money more towards where the kids are. Whereas if you're using a weight, those districts that do well, that really gain equalized pupils, would have the ability, but others would be losing because of just how it gets skewed because of that weight, and that would make it more difficult for them, I think.
Yeah, I mean, but all these decisions are made at the local level based on what the needs are within the community. So I understand that when we look at the graph that you have here with the comparison, that there's some concern that would be expressed by the school that's on the left-hand side of that graph. But they don't need what the other schools require in order to provide equal education for kids from other cultures. So I continue to be concerned that we are disenfranchising, we may be disenfranchising students if we go into the categorical aid route. I am still very concerned about that, but that's just me. And I am influenced by my district, but I have to say, I could see an influx of students in Bennington and Brattleboro and all across the state. And those schools would deserve similar resources to accomplish the goals that they would like to accomplish based on their local decisions. So.
And I agree with you completely in that these are local decisions, and people are choosing to spend what they're choosing to spend. Giving them more tax capacity, giving them more money, is that going to change what money they're giving actually to those kids? I don't know. I would like to think it would, but I don't know. If you look at that blue table, that blue chart I've got here, any of those lines on the left that are not all on that pretty even line, that means they have kids. They have ELL kids right now, and if this was going into place right now, their equalized pupil count would drop. And so I mean, I think that's part of what, I'm not trying to persuade you one way or the other, but I think that's part of why people are looking at the categorical grant more so than they are the weight, because they would be losing capacity to serve those kids unless the district chooses to spend more and have a higher tax rate. Whereas with a categorical grant, that money would be coming in.
Can you tell me sort of where Alberg sits in that list?
If you give me a minute, I can.
It's the fourth one from I don't know, because I'm getting emails from all over the state supporting the weights, and I want to know, what is the fundamental interest? Is it on principle, or is it because they have
Tax policy.
Yeah.
Senator Perchlik, while Brad James is looking for that, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's because people want to support ELL, so they're like, update the weights. And I think it's important to notice that when we talk to Dr. Kolber, she says update the weights, but a lot of the emails say do the correct weight. There isn't a correct weight. They're like, because of the study, we have a much better idea of what weight is likely to be, but it's just creating an average. But people want to do that. But I think what's failed to think about is that the schools would get a grant. It's not weight or nothing. It's a weight or an equal amount of money as some kind of grant. And that's why, but there's concerns about just picking a number, 22,000, as Dr. Colby pointed out. well, if we did a reimbursement type of formula, they could still make those local decisions. And we could make it very broad so that cultural liaisons and other kind of work that's not like in-class instruction, but is important for the success of EL students is included in that. It is a reason why I think, why I supported it in the task force.
If I may also, Mr. James, we've been talking a lot about, hey, these districts are going to see tax increases, all that kind of thing. We're just looking at EL, and we're just talking about weights right now as it relates to English language learners. I mean, other weights could shift all of this, correct?
Well, yes, other weights will, but that's what we're seeing here. I mean,
I
remember,
understand.
all
Okay.
those other weights.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
They're behind that. The only difference here is that I
Okay.
added the ELL weight.
Yeah.
And just before I forget, Senator Lyons, Alberg in FY20 had no ELL students listed. So,
Well, pretty fascinating.
they may have them now. I don't know.
Senator Chittenden.
To Senator Perchlik's point, I think there is a path in the future to look at categorical aid for different, not just ELL, but a bunch of these weights. But where I'm seeing the most value from your work is, I think the cost equity approach of paying down based on fairly assessed weights is going to move us towards a better, more fair, equitable, both tax equity as also, and then we got to start talking about the other apple cart to kick, the student equitable access to educational opportunity. So I don't disagree that there's merit in continuing to think about categorical aid. I don't see it as necessary right now, and I don't see it as the right fit based on all the testimony that we've had. I see more merit in telling finance that the cost equity approach will likely achieve better taxpayer equity. I need to work on my way of communicating.
Senator Perchlik.
Just to try to clarify that, are you saying that the cost equity approach, but keep ELL as a weight and do cost equity for everything else except ELL? So kind of, we're talking about everything as a weight except ELL as a grant, but you're talking about doing the reverse?
Using an ELL weight from Professor Colby as the original amount in using that in the cost equity approach.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
and that's what the most.
Hold on, I just want Senator Perchlik to finish.
That's and I agree with you that the cost equity approach is the preferable approach, like for everything. Like I'd rather move everything towards that. And that's why it's one of the options of the task force to see if we could figure that out. Because of this kind of impact that Mr. James pointed out, we said like, well, let's kind of basically start the cost equity program with the ELL grant, because this is the ELL grant is part of the cost equity. It would be figured out the same way.
I thought there was a way that we could use the weight from Professor Colby in the cost equity approach.
Professor Colby did
dollar amount is, but it's not a weighted student.
She came out with a number that for this year, FY20, would have been $23,874 per ELL student. So there is a number that is being used that you will see once we get some more information put together.
Final questions. We're continuing this tomorrow with Public Assets Institute and a few other guests. But right now, anything else for Mr. James? Okay, thanks, Brad.
You're very welcome. Nice seeing you all.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Daphne, will you take us off for a minute so everybody can